Доброе утро, уважаемые
Good
дамы.
morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. I'm happy to welcome everyone at the Russian-European Climate Conference to dialogue on climate policies and next steps for the implementation of the Paris Agreement in the EU and Russia. That will be the first climate forum in Russia of such scale and such a level of representation. We hope that the conference will become a platform for open discussions and prolific dialogue between the main stakeholders from the EU and the Russian Federation, providing a great opportunity for identifying the areas of common interest in climate matters. The co-organizers of the conference are the Moscow Management School, Skolkovo, and the EU delegation to the Russian Federation. We are broadcasting from the Skolkovo School, from the Glassroom Studio. And, together with me, I'll have two more participants here. The rest of us will be joining online. And I would like to invite here to our studio the EU ambassador to the Russian Federation. Welcome, Mr. Marcus Eder. Your Excellency, hello. I'm happy to see you. Please take a seat. That's your seat. And one more participant today with us in the studio is Ruslan Terkereyev, Presidential Advisor and Special Envoy of the President of the Russian Federation for Climate Matters. Hello, Ruslan. Good morning. Happy to see you. That's the first day of winter. Hope finally I will have snow here, and we're very much inspired. Okay, thank you. So we are starting our workday, and we're going into the first plenary session that's called Climate and Decarbonization Strategies in the COVID-19 Era, Perspectives from Russia and the EU. Let me briefly introduce the participants. Franz Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission in charge of the European Green Deal. Ruslan Terkereyev, whom I have already introduced, advisor to the President of the Russian Federation and Special Presidential Representative on Climate Issues, Clara Delatorre, Deputy Director General for Climate Action with the European Commission, Pavel Zavalny, Chairman of the State Duma's Energy Committee of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation, Karsten Sach, Director General of the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Natural Conservation and Nuclear Safety, Kirill Komarov, First Deputy Director General and Director of the Bank for Development of and International Businesses of Rosatom, and Stefan Nyström, Head of the Climate Department at the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, Anatoly Chubais, Chairman of the Executive Board of Rusnano, and Alexander Vedyakin, First Deputy Chairman of the Board of Sberbank. Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you here in this Skolkovo studio. The Russian Federation joined the Paris Agreement and is completing some important steps to improve its climate policies, whereas the European Union committed to reach climate neutrality by 2050 and has just started discussion of expanding its ambitions in greenhouse gas emissions in the horizon to 2030. What will be the next steps in the implementation of the Paris Agreement and climate action in Russia and the EU? I would invite here for a few words His Excellency Ambassador Ederer. Please open the session.
Dear Ruslan Edelgeriev, dear Franz Timmermans, in Brussels, Executive Vice President of the Commission, it is a pleasure for me to be here in Skolkovo today, together with Ruslan Edelgeriev, Presidential Special Representative for Climate Issues, who I thank not only for his presence, but also for your strong commitment in our fight against climate change. I would also warmly like to welcome the speakers of today, in particular the first panel, and all the viewers who have registered in great numbers, and we are grateful for that. And I hope we will all share experience and our views on the ongoing issues of climate change. I'm grateful to you, Andrei, President Cheronov, and of course Tatiana Mitrova of the Energy Center of the Skolkovo School of Management for having co-organized this with us. Thank you so much. The conference will start with a keynote speech by Franz Timmermans, who I see on the screen, First Executive Vice President of the European Commission. And I think his presence in itself is a signal and a symbol for the importance the EU attaches to Russia as a partner in the fight against climate change. And another fact also speaks to that. This is the first big such conference the EU organizes outside its borders on issues of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see from the program, we have chosen to be ambitious. Over 3 days, experts and stakeholders will discuss all dimensions of climate policies, from decarbonisation strategies or sustainable mobility, from smart cities to finance, from renewable energy to forests, from hydrogen economy to the Arctic, and from adaptation to climate change to climate reporting. And we should not neglect the role civil society plays here. And this is why we have also designed a panel with NGOs and civil society actors. We had to be ambitious, not only because of the existential threat that climate change represents to humanity, but I think also for the particular relevance in the EU-Russia relations. As you know, the EU has decided to become carbon neutral by 2050, and it was followed by pretty much all of Russia's neighbors in the East, Japan, South Korea, China by 2060. And it is also true that more than 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to energy production, energy usage. And at the same time, the EU and Russia are each other's biggest importer and exporter of energy. So these facts alone mean that any action to truly address climate change is bound to profoundly affect our respective economies and therefore also our relations. So I would suggest to you that we are at the crossroads, both when it comes to energy transition, and as an EU ambassador to Russia, I can say we are also again at a crossroads in our relations. So we need to talk. We need to talk to clear any misunderstandings and set things straight. We also need to talk to build trust and overcome our fear of changing well-established methods of production and our structures, the structures of our economies. And last, we need to talk to support each other in reaping the benefits of a decarbonized economy. So I would say that this three-day conference is a great opportunity to identify new areas of mutual climate action and potential joint activities between the EU and Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, let us make peace with our planet Earth, because there is no planet B. Maybe a new meaning to miru, mir. Let us take advantage of these 3 days for possible convergence on some major issues, and they exist, as we will see, to share our expertise and knowledge to the benefit of our people, our economies, and our planet. I wish you a successful conference. Thank you so much for your attendance.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Господин посол работал в...
His Excellency worked in Russia in the early 90s, which is why he knows the Russian slogans very well. And they're becoming relevant again. Dear colleagues, we have 1 hour, 48 minutes ahead of us, and we'll have one keynote speaker, Mr. Franz Timmermans. He'll speak for 15 minutes, and about 15 minutes for Q&A for him, followed by our panel discussion, 5 to 7 minutes interventions. And we have some questions from the organizers and from the viewers. We have 1,800 people registered for the conference, and we'll have a small period of time for general discussion. So let's begin. And now I pass the floor to our keynote speaker, Franz Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, European Green Deal.
Good morning, everyone. Доброе утро. Желаю вам всего доброго.
So I wish you all the best.
You this morning. For us, this conference, for us at the European Commission, this conference is of extreme importance for the bilateral relationship we have with the Russian Federation and the bilateral relationship that we want to expand in this area that is undoubtedly one of the most challenging humanity has to face. What I want to do this morning is to explain the rationale of the European Green Deal and how this Green Deal could also be a basis for enhancing cooperation between the European Union and the Russian Federation. The rationale for the Green Deal, obviously, is our attempt to bring the climate crisis under control. We've already seen that with a rise of temperature of 1 degree, the effects of climate change are huge. And I think Russia is a case in point when you see what's happening to the permafrost, when you see what's happening to the forests. We've seen a lot of reporting from Russia in this area. So what we thought was, could we make a plan so that we can comply with the Paris Agreement, so that we can make sure that we keep the rise of the temperature within margins that still would allow humanity to control the consequences of climate change. And it is absolutely clear that if the rise of temperature would go beyond 2 degrees, we would reach a number of tipping points that would no longer allow us to control the effects of climate change. So the Green Deal was built on this, taking Europe's responsibility in the framework of the special responsibility we have, being one of the most industrialized parts of the world. And we came to the conclusion that to do what we need to do to make the Paris Agreement work, we need to be a climate neutral continent by 2050. We want to lead by saying to the world, we can be climate neutral by 2050. But if you want to be climate neutral by 2050, you have to devise the policies to get you there. So what we did at the beginning of this mandate of this commission a year ago we present a plan that will take us to climate neutrality in 2050 with the intermediary steps involved. If we want to get there, we also know that based on the latest knowledge we have, our ambitions for 2030, which were reducing emissions by 40% as compared to 1990, were not enough because that would only take us to about 60% reduction in 2050, where we need to go to zero. So we then understood we would have to increase our ambitions also for 2030. Otherwise, what we needed to do after 2030 would be too steep and too difficult, and our economy and society would not be able to cope with that. So we decided to make a very thorough analysis, so-called impact assessment, of the consequences of having a higher ambition. And we came to the conclusion that an ambition of a reduction in 10 years' time to minus 55%, which is 55% less than in 1990 in terms of emissions, is feasible. Difficult, but feasible. And we made a very thorough analysis of what would be necessary. A bit to my surprise, we discovered that for industry, this is a path that can be followed. It's difficult, but it can be followed. The three areas where we would be challenged especially are the built environment, transport, because emissions in transport continue to go up before the pandemic, and agriculture. So we had this plan already, and then of course the pandemic struck and our economies were hit in a terrible way. And we needed to come together as European Union to find a way out of this. The one historic thing that happened is that in July, all member states came together and devised a plan that would allow us an investment level of up to 1.8 trillion euros, which is unprecedented at a European scale. And we also discovered that the Green Deal is not just an answer to the climate crisis, but is also the strategy we can use to recover from the COVID crisis. Because we're not just faced with a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, we're also faced with an industrial revolution that would demand our economy to move to a next phase anyway. So we decided to use the Green Deal as our growth strategy. Green Deal, which also needs digitization to be successful, and the investment would then be put to good use, and member states agreed that at least 30% of the investment will be used for climate policy, 20% for digitization, and 100% would not go in a different direction. So the do no harm principle is the basis of our agreement. Now, what we also need to do in implementing this is to make sure we have the support of the population. For that to happen, we need to make sure the transition is just, that we leave no one behind. And for that to happen, we have to combine long-term goals with short-term results. And I want to give you one example where this seems to be working really well. And that is what we call the renovation wave. 40% of our energy use is in buildings, heating and cooling of buildings. If we can reduce that faster, that percentage, the carbon footprint will be reduced, but also energy poverty can be avoided. And that's why we have started to roll out the renovation wave, which would also create immediate jobs for small and medium-sized enterprises in those cities and countries where the renovation wave would be applied. It would insulate homes, it would put solar panels or other forms of sustainable energy connected to the homes and schools and hospitals. And it would create, I think it will create a level of enthusiasm to see that you can bring your energy bill down and at the same time increase the value of your home in a way that you can afford. So that's just one example of where we think this will work together. Now, as the ambassador already said, in the relationship between the European Union and Russia, the energy transition is going to be of extreme importance. And of course, you see that across the globe, energy producing and exporting nations are starting to think about the strategies of a post-carbon society and economy and what that means for them. Now, there's many aspects we could look into, but there's one area I specifically wanted to mention. In the energy transition, hydrogen will start to play an increasingly important role. Why? Well, first of all, because there are difficult to abate sectors where electricity as such is not going to be a solution. We will need hydrogen, for instance, to make steel, or in the cement production, or in other areas. We will need hydrogen for heavy transport. We need hydrogen as a basis for synthetic fuels in aviation and elsewhere. So hydrogen will also be needed as a carrier of energy to transport it over longer distances. If you generate renewable energy on sea through offshore wind, you can then transform that into hydrogen and transport it over larger distances. Hydrogen is also useful as a storage facility for energy. So hydrogen offers a huge opportunity. And I know that also in Russia, hydrogen is seen as an interesting option. Of course, what we aim for is green hydrogen that is produced by renewable energy. But hydrogen, blue hydrogen, which is produced with decarbonized natural gas, is also in the transition an important element. And I do believe this would be an interesting option to further explore in the bilateral relationship between the European Union and Russia. But I also want to insist that this bilateral relationship goes beyond mere energy, because the challenges we face as societies caused by climate change and biodiversity loss is comparable, and the solutions we can find together might really help our societies improve. As some of you know, I had the privilege of living in Russia for over 3 years. I know it's 20 years ago, but I still have very, very fond memories, especially of the overwhelming natural beauty of the Russian Federation and the overwhelming vibrance of its natural environment, and the way it can sustain the way of life the Russian people want to have. And we have I think humanity has a responsibility to make sure this vital asset of the Russian Federation, which is clearly threatened by climate change, retains its vibrancy and retains its power and retains its beauty. And I believe, for instance, in forestry, we will have to look for common solutions, because our forests are really suffering already because of climate change, and this could get a lot worse. Let me end by mentioning the international dimension of all of this. As the ambassador has already said, other nations are following suit. Xi Jinping has announced carbon neutrality by 2060. Japan has announced climate neutrality by 2050, as has South Korea, as has South Africa. The Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, has clearly committed to being a partner again in the Paris Agreement. So collectively, we have a responsibility to be well prepared for COP26 in Glasgow in November next year. And I would really like to enhance the cooperation with the Russian authorities to make sure that we are on the same page in preparing Glasgow, and to make sure that Glasgow becomes a resounding success for climate policy, so that we can convince the world as a whole to embrace the idea that we can face the challenge of climate change and face it down. And for that, we need the Russian Federation to be very active on the scene. And I am at your disposal to work with you on this. Thank you very much for your attention. Спасибо вам огромное. And I hope that I can answer the questions if you have them. Thank you. Спасибо.
Спасибо, господин Тиммерманс. Да.
Thank you so much, Mr. Timmermans. Indeed, we do have questions. And the first one concerns your assessment of policies of such two large global players as China and the US. What do you expect from them in terms of supporting the Green Deal of the European Commission?
Well, you know, we have different starting positions. There are things we have in common, and there are things that divide us, both with the Chinese and with the Americans. With the Chinese, it's becoming more and more clear that we want to work together on a number of issues, but that there's still some areas where we need to clarify positions, and we are in a dialogue with them on that. For instance, and this also applies to Russia, when do you peak your emissions? What is the year that you commit to that you will reach the highest level of your emissions and then go down? We need to be clear on when that is, on what the conditions are under which this happens. And again, this also applies to our relationship with Russia. Just as to give you an example where we still have debates. With the Americans, of course, we have to wait for the new administration to come into office. President-elect Biden has been very clear in stressing the importance of climate policy. His appointment of John Kerry as his envoy is, I think, a good signal. But also here, we will have to work and clarify where our ideas converge. And, we have a rendezvous, which is extremely important, and that is COP26 in Glasgow. And I would hope that before this rendezvous, we can clarify where we agree and where we disagree and try and find common ground also with Russia so that this COP26 becomes a big success. But globally speaking, the good news is that most global players are moving in the same direction and increasingly at higher speed. So I think the sense of urgency that this is a crisis we need to face is increasing, and I would say that is good news.
Спасибо. Еще один вопрос.
Thank you so much. One more question. His Excellency has already mentioned that the green agenda discussion in Russia did not start yesterday. And you can see that here in Russia, there are different opinions. There are people who talk about the curse of our natural resources and those who speak of resource privilege. And this part of people views the negative consequences of the implementation of the carbon adjustment mechanism, and some even say that it's green protectionism and condemn it. What would you answer to this part of the Russian economy?
I can fully understand this, and this is a fear everybody has. And we have to avoid any steps that would lead us into a spiraling protectionist reaction in all of this. So what could avoid this is that if we commit to the Paris Agreement, and if we then take concrete measures that take us into the direction of our commitments of the Paris Agreement, then the European Union would not need to take measures at the border. But if we commit to this, and our industries and our sectors take extra measures to decarbonize and to put a price on carbon, and the outside world or some parts of the outside world don't do that, then we risk carbon leakage, that is our industry leaving to those parts of the world where there are no restrictions or less restrictions, or we risk unfair competition because it will have a price effect if you take extra measures to decarbonize. So under those conditions, we believe that we have to correct that difference at the border, and we believe that is also in line with the requirements of the World Trade Organization. So these are very specific conditions, and we are analyzing now sector per sector and country per country where this might be necessary in the future. But I tried to explain what the very strict conditions is under which we do this, and a world collectively moving towards implementing the Paris Agreement will not need these measures. But if some do and others don't, then some correction at the borders will be necessary.
Еще один вопрос.
One more question. In your opinion, how do these processes and decarbonization policies will affect the relations between Russia and the EU? Because the EU is the largest economic partner for Russia, despite the sanctions even.
Well, yes, I think the world as a whole, and especially energy, fossil fuel producing countries, we will all have to face the fact that fossil fuel does not have a long-term future, and that we will collectively have to make sure that those countries who depend a lot on fossil fuel have an opportunity to transform their economy and society so that they can prosper in a post-fossil fuel society. This is a very long-term project. And in this, I would say both those countries who produce fossil fuels and those who consume fossil fuels or import fossil fuels, rather, have a collective responsibility. This is not something we can just leave to those countries who will have to get used to the fact that they will start exporting less and less. It is about making this transition together. And I believe, and I've said this many, many times before, not because I'm talking to you this morning, I honestly believe that the fates of the European Union and Russia are deeply interlinked on this. And causing trouble for one of both sides is going to hurt both sides. So we better make sure that we find a way of creating a positive dynamic, both for energy importing and for energy exporting societies. This change is coming. It's coming quite rapidly because we're talking about 30 years, which is, you know, if I think back that it's been already 20 years that I lived in Moscow, and I know exactly where I lived and how I lived, and I know exactly who my friends are. And it's already been 20 years. 30 years is a blink of an eye in human history. And so we have a lot to do. And I really want to extend the invitation to work very closely with the Russian authorities to make this a success for both sides.
И завершающий вопрос,
And the final question for Mr. Timmermans. How will the current crisis, both economic and in terms of lockdown, affect the agenda and the timeline of implementation of this issue?
That the pandemic has changed people's priorities. People are worried about their health, about their loved ones, about their jobs. But interestingly enough, in the European Union, the climate crisis is still very much on people's minds, even if it's not their first priority. And what I also find intriguing is that at the level of national governments, and especially at the level of economic operators, the private sector, combining our efforts to face down the pandemic and the climate crisis is seen as the logical attitude. So before the pandemic, you still had a choice. Do I invest now in the economic transition or later? I can wait. Now that choice has been taken away. We have mobilized the possibility to invest massively to come out of the crisis. We need to make sure we do this in a way that is in line with the Green Deal. And I think there is almost total consensus in the European Union that this is the way forward. And I hope we can convince our international partners to make similar operations, because as I said before, you know, it's not just the COVID pandemic. It's not just a climate crisis. We're also in an industrial revolution. So we need to adapt our economic structures anyway. So let's combine these challenges and turn them into one big opportunity, also in our relationship with Russia.
Спасибо, господин Тиммерманс.
Thank you, Mr. Timmermans. I will be going back to all the speakers with some questions at the end of the session yet, but now I would like to ask Ruslan Dragiriev, presidential representative, special representative of the President for Climate Issues, to take the floor. Good morning, dear colleagues. Once again, let me welcome Mr. Timmermans. Finally, we meet, though only online, but we still can exchange our opinions on the current agenda. Undoubtedly, today, the climate agenda is very vast, including the COP26 and the contributions, defined contributions of the state, the development of these strategies, and frankly speaking, the cross-border regulation of the EU is very sensitive, and the new climate agenda of the American administration. So all of this gives us a lot of work, and we are largely prepared to handle it. We've also seen the Russian Federation and the EU as big emission sources and big trade partners develop new approaches to national climate regulation. In the Russian Federation, they have already published the presidential decree on the restriction of emissions. and we therefore provided our voluntary contribution to the common cause. We're developing a law on the restriction of emissions and the strategy of low greenhouse gas development by 2050. And all these tools are enabling us to transition. As Mr. Timmermans has mentioned in his report, the transitions in Russia and elsewhere must be consecutive and mutually beneficial, because any barriers and any restrictions to any countries are sure to result in conflict, which is absolutely against the Paris Agreement. And I absolutely agree with Mr. Timmermans in that the transition must be smooth and it must be mutual, respecting the interests of all the countries, both developed and developing. Also, we surely consider that the cross-border carbon regulation at the initial stage can be very negative. So, at the very beginning, we should harmonize our actions. Because if we do not interact from the onset, we will not reach the global goals we're claiming, global emission reduction. By the way, let me tell you that overall, the Russian Federation has reduced its emissions by 41 billion tons of CO2 equivalent to the base year. If I'm not mistaken, over the same period, the EU reduced its emissions by 19 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. And in principle, the Russian Federation has contributed the most to the reduction of emissions currently. We understand that in some sectors, we have not reached our peak emissions yet. But we do see these challenges and we do see these trends. And in accordance with the Paris Agreement, in the second half of this century, we will be reducing our emissions. We understand the responsibility. The Russian Federation has always been environmentally and climatically responsible. Having said that, we are concerned about the introduction of the cross-border carbon regulation by the EU against certain energy exporters. The European Green Deal is quite an ambitious project aimed at structural reconstruction of the economy of this integration unit. The climate change is a global challenge of our generation and cannot be solved alone. And I insist again that all the measures introduced should be in line with the Paris Agreement and the WTO. In our country, we will be piloting the new approach in some regions. We will be test driving the new mechanisms of regulation, carbon quotas, and we would like for the EU, together with the Russian Federation and the regions that we have pilots in, to interact from the very beginning so that the Russian Federation and the regions where our European partners think should implement more rigorous climatic standards could really comply with the requirements. And we could see how our future trade and economic interactions play out, given this. As a country, we don't want this cross-border adjustment mechanism to reroute financial flows. And we can create our own system of emission trading, and we invite international businesses to implement climatic projects in the Russian Federation because it's much more economically feasible here, cheaper. And any joint action of ours will only benefit the global goals of emission reduction, and it may actually lead to economic growth instead of the current decline in every country. So our joint activities should only benefit the economies. A lot has already been said, and I would not like to repeat it, but I think it's important for us to start the discussion as soon as possible, to hear each other's opinions. So Overall, let me just say once again that the Russian Federation, at the business and private initiative level and at the government level, has been working very actively on the structural changes in the economy and the energy transition. And you have noted yourselves that our companies explore alternative energy sources, including hydrogen, and we pay a lot of attention to the nuclear sector as well, because currently its opportunities, let me be frank, are underestimated. And we could reach a great reduction in emissions if we harness nuclear power. Of course, taking into account all the security measures and all the responsibilities for our actions. So I call upon everyone to work together. All of our endeavors and initiatives should, of course, be harmonized beforehand to make sure that we do reach our global goal of emission reduction, not just do this topically. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Ruslan. A few questions. You have already mentioned the numbers, the country's commitments. How do you think the 70% to 1990 target, how ambitious is this for Russia? Because right now the indicators are even lower than this. Well, currently, we all know that the current indicator is 52.4%, but this 70% can also be considered. I mean, if we have 52.4% today, and in some time we'll have 62%, and in some sectors, the peak consumption, the peak emissions have not been reached, but the country has been working on this. The companies have been working on this. We are very well aware of the challenge. And we understand that the demand for fossil fuels by 2030 will be dropping. We see all this, and we reflect all this in our strategies. Let me repeat again that 70% implies that if today we have 52%, in 5 years we can reach 62. Through economic growth, you mean? Yes, among other things. Yes, and some, one more question on energy consuming sectors. Do we have the assets, do we have the infrastructure to decarbonize sectors with high energy consumption? Yes, and I think it's our responsibility to ensure smooth structural changes. Of course, high energy consuming sectors suffer the most, and they are the most sensitive ones to the current changes. But it is undoubtable that we need to decarbonize, and by 2030, if each individual company wants to be competitive, they must tackle this. And it doesn't need to be explained to people. It's in the economic interest of every company, and our companies have been catching up with this. And the only thing here is that we need to avoid any jumps and waves and ebbs and flows. We need to ensure a smooth transition and give them time and to support them. We cannot leave some companies behind if they were driving progress for a while. And now in this fourth or whatever transition, they may still have catching up to do, because it's still our companies, the same companies that further can work with hydrogen and other resources. We need not leave them behind. That would just be stupid. We need to retrain people and need to cover everyone. The endpoint is competitiveness. So by 2030, if companies want to be competitive, they must decarbonize. And the final question, in your opinion, are these global changes, especially in energy-rich segments, possible without budgetary support? And do we even have this kind of money in the budget? And in general, how would you assess the economic impact of such transition for the Russian economy? Is it positive? Is it negative in terms of economic visibility? Well, frankly, short term, of course, it will be negative. We all know very well that our economy is carbon intensive and it depends on fossil fuel trade. But I can tell you now, we have companies that are already leaders in the reduction of emissions for particular products. And it's to some extent due to the carbon regulation. It's some extent related to the carbon regulation in the EU. In the aluminum sector, for instance, our companies have been producing with minimum greenhouse emissions compared to our companies, other companies. So the question is, these companies don't need to be regulated like this. So we'll look at our foreign colleagues' actions and we'll adjust our actions accordingly. Because we see sometimes that companies do not need to be supported because they have already achieved these good environmental results. But there are also companies that do need to be supported through the transition with subsidies, helping them modernize their production, reach energy efficiency. It's one of the most resource-intensive challenges. And of course, this needs a lot of investments. And we need to look at this at the individual basis. The Ministry of Economy and Economic Development and Ministry of Energy must look into every company's situation. And if a company is going to structurally change and modernize, tailor their support, given the complexity and the financial intensity of the process. We should do this, I think. Thank you, Ruslan. And now for Ms. Clara de la Torre, Deputy Director General for Climate Action of the European Commission, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. First of all, many thanks to the European Union delegation in Russia, and in particular Ambassador Ederer, and of course to the Skolkovo Energy Center for co-organizing this major conference. I would also, if you allow me, to specially greet Mr. Nedelgereyev, with whom I had the honor to discuss last summer. Climate policy has very, very sound and grounds and principles on which it is based, which is climate science. And this climate science is crystal clear and is compelling for action. So not only climate change is a reality, as we all know as well, which is overwhelmingly caused by human action, but it is also unfortunately happening faster than we had foreseen. We know that since pre-industrial era, our temperatures have raised more than 1 degree, Celsius degree, and we have very little time. We have time, but we have very little time to correct our trajectory to stay below the 1.5 degrees. Therefore, humanity, and not least Russia and the European Union, need absolutely to cut emissions. And not in 10 years. We've heard what's the magnitude of time. We heard it from Vice President Timmermans. We need to act now. We heard from the Executive Vice President that the green recovery is what the European Union has kickstarted, bringing us into a decarbonization journey, because we want absolutely to ensure to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And this is a call for joint action, a call for global cooperation, as previous speakers have referred to. So to make it happen, as you know, the European Union has proposed, the European Commission has proposed that we already increased our ambition in 2030, for 2030, and we will reduce our emissions by 55% compared to the 40% that is currently in force. And we know we can work with it. It is economically sound and is technologically possible. And the European Union, I would like this message to remain with us, that the European Union has shown that it is possible to decouple economic growth and reduction of emissions. Since 1990, the GDP of the European Union has grown by 62%, while at the same time we have reduced emissions by 25%. We know that there are some skeptics that would say this is too ambitious, this is too expensive, we cannot afford it. Well, this could have been said before we have launched the COVID recovery, because we have now once in a generation possibility to invest smartly the 1.8 trillion euros that we're putting on the table and that are being unlocked. And as the Vice President reminded us, 30% of these will go to climate-related investment, the rest being at least of no harm to our policy. People in the European Union, and certainly beyond, are increasingly concrete, seeing in the way they see the consequences of climate change, including in health, in water scarcity, in agriculture. Therefore, climate adaptation to the already effects that we suffer in our economy is a challenge of our generation as much as mitigation. The latest and still conservative estimates of the European Union from just a few sectors show that by exposing the present EU economy to global warming of 3%, we will have a reduction of at least 1.4% of our GDP. This is why we are presenting at the beginning of next year a new adaptation strategy to propose stepped up game, strengthening our efforts on climate proofing, resilience of buildings, prevention and preparedness for events for our economy. We are also in this strategy trying to influence, to drive in the smart way, the public and private investments. And not least, we are integrating climate change into risk management of our every business and public endeavors. So based on this analysis and given the particular geography of Russia, we feel that there is also a very important challenge in Russia on climate adaptation, and we should be prepared, we could be prepared to work together in those. We should not forget that climate change makes only losers. It's a structural threat to what is a prosperous Russian economy. And we have, unfortunately, short-term negative effects that, if treated properly, could turn into short-term advantages, not comparable to the massive long-term advantages of a smart adaptation to climate policy. There is a demanding path to net zero emissions by 2030, and it is also a demanding but potentially rewarding path for the Union and Russia to approach it in a constructive and effective way, drawing in each other's experience. This does not mean that we have to take each other's model, because each country has its own specificities and its own assets and its own starting point. But within our experience, we stand ready to engage with the Russian Federation and to provide support to help Russia reap all the benefits from investing in a climate neutral future. The Russian Federation accepted the Paris Agreement last year and just submitted the updated nationally determined contribution ahead of COP26. And these are indeed promising first steps. But engaging on the decarbonization pathway that is in line with the Paris Agreement and with what science tells us requires more. Doing too little, in particular in this moment, equals failure. Everything, science and markets, is pointing into one clear direction, aiming at net zero emissions in the 3 or 4 coming decades is going to be the driver of our economy. And as Mr. Edelgerayev already mentioned, there are many Russian companies that are already factoring in global trends and climate risks, coming up with a corporate decarbonization strategy and ambitious actions, and they can only be welcome. This is why we urge the Russian Federation, like all our international partners, to put in place a clear and robust low emissions plans in combination with the national recovery strategies. This ambition should set the Russian economy on a course to consistently reduce emissions starting from now and aiming at climate neutrality by 2050, or at least as early as possible. It is only through a clear direction of travel and determination that we can provide businesses, investors, and not least the citizens with the needed predictability and with a vision for the future, which is appealing. A clear long-term strategy will help us not only to speed up transition to more resilient and sustainable economy, but also, as the Vice President was telling us, to modernize our economies and make them more livable. Last but certainly not least, as many of the negative consequences are already impacting us, be it in form of heat waves or the related forest fires or the intensifying Arctic melt, we strongly invite Russia to come up with robust adaptation measures in order to reduce the impact of what we will not be able to avoid. Ladies and gentlemen, we have only a few options ahead of us: ignoring the climate change and the science behind it, climate fatalism, leading to believe that it is too late and the trend is gone, or climate optimism. And I personally choose this one because I have faith in science, I have faith in humanity, and I think it is never too late to do the right thing. We have very little time, but we still have some time. So we can build on a reciprocal, genuine commitment to the Paris Agreement without ignoring where we disagree, but certainly within the frames that serve as a basis for the European Union and Russian relations. This conference will be an excellent opportunity to ignite, or in some cases, reignite discussions on how and where we can move forward together. Спасибо.
Спасибо, госпожа де ла Торре.
Thank you, Ms. de la Torre. It is obvious that following the Green Deal, for some companies or even whole sectors, will be painful in terms of changing the economic model, their technologies, and will put them on the brink of extinction overall. So, what is the EU's vision of this problem? Who is to support such companies? Who will be working with the employees who are released from these sectors, and what is the separation of powers here between the EU and national governments?
In the European Union, you know that we have a value which is entrenched in our treaties, which is the solidarity and fairness. And therefore, in all our policies, we have well embedded social dimension. And in particular now, in the recovery plans, we do have initiatives which are supporting either very, very short-term losses of jobs, but more importantly, or rather I say more in line with the climate policy, we have schemes like the Modernization Fund, which is helping precisely those economies that are more reliant on fossil fuels to transform their economies, reskill workers that might be losing their jobs, and creating jobs of higher added value and more sustainable. We have, as you know, we have a regional policy already with a long tradition in the European Union, which embeds precisely the needs of those that are starting from a lower level. But it is indeed, there are indeed bad consequences for some sectors and some citizens. But let us not forget that these negative consequences are much, much smaller than the positive consequences that we will, positive impact that the climate policy coupled with the just transition can yield. We will have better health. We will have better, lower energy bills, whether for the private sector or whether for the enterprises or for the citizens, and we will have better management of our water resources. We will have a lot of positive consequences, which will outweigh the negative ones, which we will try to diminish as much as we can. Certainly, this recovery, coupled with the Green Deal and the digital transition, will bring the European Union to a better world and with a more competitive economy.
Thank you so much, Ms. De La Torre. And now I pass the floor to Pavel Zavalny, head of the Energy Committee of the State Duma of Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. Over to you. Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. I would also like to welcome the EU ambassador to the Russian Federation. Hello, Mr. Ederer. A week ago, we discussed our positions on the climatic goals in an online video conference, and he invited me at this point to take part in this conference. For a long time, our committee has been dealing with decarbonization and climate policies, and we've been participating in the legislative processes. We've held expert discussions and roundtable. Recently, for instance, energy savings roundtables, the Paris Agreement and its goals and targets for our energy sector. We also had a hydrogen energy roundtable recently. And we look into the impact of these policies in our legislation. As you all know, Russia not only has vast resources of energy carriers, but also it exports about half of them, and half of the resources are reinvested into our economy. We have nuclear energy and hydro energy, and we also export some technologies in this. A low-carbon energy accounts for about 70% of our energy mix. We are in line with the global sustainability goals, and currently we account for 4.4 the global greenhouse gas emissions after China, the US, and the EU. The president tasked us with lowering the emissions and increasing the goal from 52.4% versus the 1990 level to 70% of reductions. And even though we are not building something totally green, as our European colleagues understand this. About 30% of our energy mix is gas, and we also have renewable energy sources. And we contribute to the development of gas opportunities. Russia joined the Paris Agreement. Even though we understand that so far it's a framework that is voluntary to accept, and it's not very specific in terms of goals. A lot will depend on the decisions at the national, European, and other regional levels. Carbon pricing is one of the most sensitive and important issues, in my opinion. Introducing such measures for the traditional energy and subsidies through these carbon pricing mechanisms is not the best way towards our goals, because this imposition of fees will distort the energy sector and hamper its development, especially as such mechanisms can be used as political tools. And in order to reach not only climate and environmental goals, but the goals of sustainable development and energy security overall, we need to increase the share of low carbon energy generation. But as practice shows, decreasing the volume of generation in and of itself does not yield the desired results in greenhouse gas emission reduction. For instance, we can see Great Britain as an example of this. Also, so far, the current energy mix ensures energy security and stable energy supply. And gas generation, low carbon generation, nuclear generation are in our priorities. We understand the priorities and act accordingly. The transition to hydrogen technologies has been reflected in the roadmap approved recently by the Russian government. We think that any sort of hydrogen generation without preferring the blue or the green one is the way to go. Methane pyrolysis has been the most feasible means for us, which allows us to maximize the efficiency of use of natural resources. And that reduced the emissions of CO2 by 50%. Recently, the Russian-German raw material forum began, where they discussed hydrogen power generation, among other things, and I will participate in this. Another important aspect of decarbonization is peaceful nuclear energy, which ensures long-term energy supply at good prices for practically every country, and it reduces the general environmental footprint through lower carbon emissions. Usually, they talk about nuclear power being unsafe. At this point, indeed, the safety is low and it hampers broader use of this source of power. But this view has been outdated, because the nuclear cycle should be closed, which will ensure more safety of the use of this nuclear power and its generation. Russia has been the first country in the world to exploit the fast neutron nuclear reactors. And it's a brand new technology that can be used both internally and exported. We've been following the international project ITER with its successes. The EU-Russian project has already yielded its first good results, and hopefully we'll have a nuclear reactor that works. If we talk about the potential of nuclear power for heat generation, we can say that all the fossil fuels in the world only account for 15% of the whole capacity of the nuclear power that we could generate in this safe way. And Rosatom colleagues will speak about this in more detail. I will not take it away from them. Unfortunately, I have to note that this green transition has been more and more politicized. An example of politicization of this topic is the rhetoric of the need to decarbonize, especially against the background of COVID-19. But the thing is that the current gas prices are low, gas is available and accessible, but international organizations have been over-pushing the decarbonization in some respects, which hampers our relations. And the Nord Stream 2 project has been over-politicized in perception as well, and I need not mention this. And this creates difficulties to this feasible project, which is weird. I'm convinced that the cost of this green transition for countries, especially countries like ours, should not be unbearable. And all the aspects have to be considered here. Currently, the price of producing solar batteries is still not comparable to the generation source, the generation means that we are offering. And against the background of the pandemic challenges, over-pushing these aspects can yield results that are different from those intended. Unfortunately, the pandemic has reduced our transport mobility. Of course, this reduced greenhouse emissions, but we still need energy sectors and economies that are viable despite such challenges and allow us to reach all the most ambitious goals within the framework of the Paris Agreement. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Zavalny. Two questions to you. It appears that the EU carbon adjustment mechanism and its adoption is just a matter of time. In this respect, how do you see the Russian climate policy? How should it change accordingly so we could live with this? Dear colleagues, as we see, the president tasked us with increasing our ambitions of carbon emission reduction to 70% from 52.4. That's really ambitious, and we need to do a lot to reach this goal. So transport is about 20% of our emissions, and buildings, etc., about 30%. Agriculture also contributes. So if we want to reach the 70% or even top them, there is a lot of potential in all the sectors that we haven't even tapped into yet. In my opinion, against the background of active efforts, any additional taxes or duties will only prevent us from reaching this. So we need to get this clear. If Europe sets ambitious goals for us, we need to look at our own goals. I mean, we only account for 4.4% of all the emissions globally. I want to stress this figure. I mean, and we've been developing more clean energy sources such as nuclear and hydrogen. We are already moving towards our goals very quickly. So, in my opinion, we needn't be punished in the process. It's unfair and unjust. Thank you. One more question. You already mentioned renewable energy sources. We are used to the fact that the most traditional ones are hydro energy, solar, wind energy, geothermal, and tides. So, in your opinion, what would the mix of renewable energy sources be in 10 or 20 years? You know, if we look at the European part of Russia and the respective price zones, wind or sun are not still feasible yet. And introducing them to a great extent will hamper the development of the economy. And I don't think it's feasible. When producing power, we mostly use gas. And gasification of the country has been ongoing. We've been expediting this process, and this will already improve our environmental situation. We also have additional programs to modernize our energy sector. Right now, 1 kilowatt hour costs about 308 grams of fuel. And in the next few years, we should reach not more than 250 grams. And that's a lot of potential that we're planning to use. In the northern and eastern parts of Russia, wind is a very good source of energy. And the price of kilowatt hour of energy is about 180 rubles if you use diesel. The Ministry of Far East and Arctic Development has been dealing with this. And currently, we've been placing a lot of hopes into electrifying the far east and northern parts of Russia using mobile diesel sources. The overall share of renewable energy sources should be 10 to 11 gigawatts. We have all the conditions for this. And now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Carsten Zach, Director General of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Natural Protection and Nuclear Safety, Germany.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I would have loved to be with you as I have been before, but it's the second best option. Thank you very much again. I would like to make 4 points. We already heard that climate change is an existential threat. Science says that very clearly, and we see, and that's good optimistic news, that there is an international trend to climate neutrality. One could argue not just states, but also companies and municipalities see that as the new normal. Therefore, going into that direction, we see as a driver of economy, and as the Executive Vice President Franz Timmermans said, it is the European Green Deal is our new growth strategy. So the second point is what are we doing in the EU and also in Germany? Germany is currently holding the EU presidency. We are making that in line with the Paris Agreement legally binding. We break down our long-term commitment into annual targets, and we apply them to all sectors. We do that because if you understand the magnitude of the challenge, only a fast start and an early start will deliver a smooth transition. And how do we do that? We are applying 3 different methodologies. On one hand, we now in Germany give a price to all economic activity. So we imply carbon pricing. We know that for big industrial sectors, we have the EU emissions trading system, but we also have a carbon price as of 1st of January next year on all heating and transport fuels. And what we would like to do is a double dividend. We want to reap a double dividend. On one hand, we are pricing externalities. On the other hand, we are creating income for our state budget, which we spend to both helping those who have difficulties to adapt and for spurring innovation. That brings me to my third point, which is the recovery out of COVID. We had a strong discussion here in Germany of what would be the right way to recover, because sectors which are hit are also those which are carbon intensive. We had a huge discussion as a big automotive producer, what kind of mobility we should support. And we did take a decision in the German government that we want to support the mobility of the future, and that we see in the individual transport electric mobility. The second big green element of our green recovery strategy was a priority on developing a hydrogen economy, because we see that as a cornerstone for producing steel in Germany also in the future, but also to using that in the airline and the shipping industry. Therefore, we put forward a big support program, and because we see a big shift in demand towards hydrogen. And that brings me to my fourth point. Here I see huge business and cooperation opportunities with Russia. So far, and Nord Stream 2 was just mentioned, you are our biggest supporter of energy. And as demand will be shifting, I think it is in our interest, both Russia and Germany and Europe, that we start early to build up a new hydrogen infrastructure and hydrogen energy support schemes. Yes, we think that the future hydrogen should be green. I think there is huge renewable energy potential in Russia, and we would be more than happy if we could work in setting up this infrastructure. With that, I think I will keep my opening remarks short and more than happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Вы упомянули...
Thank you so much. You have mentioned Nord Stream. Do you see its prospects in terms of carbon supplies or hydrogen supplies?
I think in the long future, I see it more in hydrogen supply. There is, of course, a period of transition, but in the long term, it's on hydrogen.
В любом случае, для этого его нужно
In any
закончить.
case, it needs to be completed. This project needs to be completed. Thank you, Mr. Zhang. And we need to speed up a bit. I would ask the speakers to be a bit quicker. So Kirill Komarov, First Deputy Director General for International Businesses and Development of Rosatom. Over to you, Kirill. Good morning, dear colleagues. Mr. Timmermans, Your Excellency, I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this significant dialogue between the EU and Russia, and despite the difficulties of today related to the pandemic, I'm sure we need to find the time to discuss such strategic global questions as the climate agenda, of course. The Paris Climate Agreement, signed 5 years ago, is at the same time a global challenge and a driver of system transformations for every country's economy. The reduction of carbon trace depends on this. The electric energy sector contributes to about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, which is why resolving issues in this sector of generation is key to environmental responsibility implementation. We have seen Europe unraveling its Green Deal, making rigorous decisions in terms of foregoing fossil fuels. This implies serious strategies and tactics and requires tools for green regulation and green standards. We see the huge work done by the EU experts developing the taxonomies of sustainable funding, setting out the criteria of sustainability for various industries. And it's also really important to note, even though it's been mentioned several times, I would like to reiterate that in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, nuclear energy is one of the cleanest ones. In Russia, where nuclear generation is the second most important source after fossil fuels, with the national share of about 20%, our nuclear power plants annually save 107 tons of CO2 equivalent, which is about 7% of the whole volume of greenhouse gas emissions in Russia. Rosatom has been working not only in Russia but globally. We're implementing our projects to build new nuclear power plants in 12 countries, and we totally share the global green agenda priorities. We take our responsibility for its implementation, and we're convinced that nuclear energy is essential for the effective implementation of our goals, because currently it's basically the only source of low carbon energy that guarantees energy security regardless of climate and weather. Russia joined the Paris Agreement in 2019, and currently we are developing the regulatory mechanisms that are implementing these provisions, including the financial tools to support green projects. We're doing a lot of work to form the market of low carbon certificates to stimulate the consumption of green generated power. And Rosatom participates actively in these processes, both as a supplier of low carbon energy, because we account for 1/5 of the whole energy in the country, and in the European part of the country, actually 40% of the whole power generation. And in shaping Russia's course, we would benefit from the examples of the EU. That's the only systemic example of today, and I'm grateful to the European colleagues who have called upon us to take into account the specific features of every country in shaping your policies. You know, we differ from the EU in principle in terms of recognition of nuclear energy as sustainable and green. We know that the attitudes of the EU are still underformed in this respect. We understand and respect the position of the EU, and we think that the Green Deal implementation must take into account the regional specifics, the available natural resources, and the historical structure of power generation in each country. I'm also convinced that climate ambitions are, of course, without borders, and keeping our planet green is, of course, our common goal. And apart from reiterating the strategic goals of the Paris Agreement here, it's really important to synchronize our national and country mechanisms and standards. This work could begin by mutual recognition of low-carbon green certificates. As far as I know, the Ministry of Energy of Russia is finalizing the federal law that will set out the basic principles of implementation of the certificates in Russia. And I think it's a good time to start working together with the EU colleagues, focusing on finding common ground rather than differences or talking about carbon taxes to implement. Going back to the role of nuclear power generation, let me briefly mention the concept that Rosatom calls the Green Square. This concept sets out 4 key low-carbon electricity sources, 2 of which are water and nuclear, and they carry the base load of networks, and wind and solar energy complement them in peak times. We are convinced that these sources of energy are not competitive, as everybody is trying to make them look, but they are mutually complementary parts of the energy mix. We all know that due to high dependency on the weather, the renewable energy sources cannot account for 100% of generation, but they're a good source of additional energy for peak periods. And the traditional sources of energy, such as nuclear, make for a good base. Of course, the energy mix will depend on geographic, economic, and even social parameters of each country. If you look not only at the EU, but the whole world, you will see that there are countries with huge potential of renewable energy development, such as the Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, and others, where there is over 300 sunny days a year, when there is good wind, especially on the shore. These countries invest more and more in the development of nuclear energy because they understand the need to have a harmonized power mix. Rosatom sees this the same way. We do not focus on the nuclear energy only. We also work on wind and energy solutions to give our clients some freedom of choice. We've been implementing projects that entail building over 1 gigawatt of wind farms in Russia. We commissioned 150 megawatt wind farm in the south of Russia, and we are completing another one that will be the largest one in Russia in Stavropol. And currently, like I said, this type of generation, nuclear generation, not only provides stable power support in Russia, but also half of carbon-free generation in the EU and over 1/4 of power generation overall. We understand the position of our EU colleagues that forego this source of energy for some reasons, but would not completely understand the feasibility of this because we see the low cost with minimum damage to the climate, and we would like for our choice to be respected, including by the EU, so that every country could have free choice out of the energy mix available within the green square that I mentioned. To summarize, I would like to say that the main thing we believe in is that the climate agenda is, of course, a long-term strategic vector of global development, and that it's only through partnership and dialogue and respect of the specific features, interests, and realities of each country that we can implement this challenging task. Thank you. I think everybody agrees that we need to live on a green and blue planet. The question is how to find a balance between economic growth and this climate agenda. In your opinion, in midterm for Russia, or maybe you can also speak for the world, in midterm for Russia, is it possible to give up or drastically reduce fossil fuel power generation? You know, you're absolutely right. There needs to be a balance of interests in anything in the world. So when we talk about climate action successes, and refer to sustainable development goals, we need to understand that it's only one of the goals. But we also have goals in terms of economic well-being, social development, and interests of individuals. And we need to look for energy solutions that could address not only one of these goals, but rather create a balanced approach. So, as to carbon sources, it's not quite my domain, and I'm not quite confident commenting on this, but in nuclear generation, we see a balance of climate, economic, and social interests. It's quite attainable, because in terms of environment protection, nuclear power generation is only worse than wind, because wind is 11 grams per kilowatt hour, while nuclear generation is 12 grams of fuel per kilowatt hour. Solar energy is 44 to compare. And a 2-unit nuclear power plant gives about 3,000 qualified jobs, employing over 10,000 people in nuclear infrastructure overall for the whole life cycle of the power plant, and that would be 60 to 100 years. So in terms of economy, we're very clear that every dollar invested in building nuclear power plants as a high-tech product will yield on average over $4 for the GDP of the host country, and gives a lot of taxes to the budget. So this example shows you that effective climate solutions are possible, but they must contribute positively to the economic and social sphere. That's the core of the concept of development of developed by the US, balance between the social and economic components for the country and for the individual. Thank you, Kirill. Now over to Anatoly Chubais. Hello, that would be head of board of Rosnano. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Let me also greet our European colleagues, Mr. Timmermans, Mr. Eder, and the Russian colleagues. I think that the very fact of today's conversation is very relevant. It's really important. First of all, because it's clear that the topic that we're discussing applies to everyone, each and everyone, without a doubt. Secondly, frankly speaking, in our current political situation, there aren't too many topics for the EU and Russia to find common line of activity. The climate area is one of the few, which is why today's conversation proves effective, and there is something for the EU and Russia here to discuss. In our country, this topic seems controversial. I mean, it's rather new for us. And looking at the business environment, political environment, expert environment, I think it's clear, even from today's contributions, if you listen carefully, it's clear that there are two camps, the conservative one and the eco-radical one. In any significant environmental issue, you can easily see this subdivision into two camps. The conservatives, when asked while the EU is implementing its active green policy, say that it was all line of action against Russia. They're unable to see anything else in it, any other point in it. They cannot appreciate it. And this position distorts their view of any topics that stem from the climate policies. For the eco-radicals, it's vice versa. Russia is a European country, which means that we in Russia must strive for the same targets, including for CO2, as the EU does, and we should have everything in common. I think that these 2 points of view lack a very important thing, which is common sense. We have to take into account that the Russian fuel and energy complex is 60% of our export, 25% of our budget, 40% of our exports overall. So just imagine any drastic change in an important sector like this that sustains the lives of tens of millions of people. Of course, you have to tread carefully here. Of course, you have to be very smart here. And it's perfectly clear that for Russia, the carbon resources are a huge advantage, in my opinion, rather than a disadvantage. But we need to be very sober and very adult in not going into the conservative camp, because otherwise in 10 to 15 years, Europe will have a brand new technosphere, different from us, of a different generation. And if we don't do anything about this, whereas we have, we have people who would not like to do anything indeed, in 10 years or even less, Russia will drop out of the global competition. Frankly speaking, the conservatives dominate and win so far. And you can see it from many signs, including the fact that we were discussing the targets of Russia, 30% reduction in emissions by 2030. Russia is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, as we all know. One of these mysteries is that 30% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 will actually give a rise in emission by over a third by today. I mean, you can call this goal anything, but it's sure not ambitious, not under any circumstances. I will not use any other terms here. It's clear that to reach this goal, we don't need to do anything at all. And looking soberly at this picture, we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do, what positive developments we still have, and how do we change the situation that we've outlined in Russia. It needs to be recognized that, in my opinion, the only significant change to have occurred in the fuel complex of Russia recently is the Russian legislation on is the Russian green energy. 3 years ago, it simply didn't exist. Right now, we have solar and wind generation. We have some industry that produces the equipment for solar or wind farms. Today, we have a scientific base that upgrades technologies here. Today, we have a very strong educational basis. I'm sorry, let me correct that. We had hydro generation before, which accounted for about 18% in the mix. And you're right, we had hydro generation of 18%, but renewable energy is only that part of hydro energy, which is less than 25 megawatts. And we have like a fraction of percent of this, which makes it right to say that we didn't have renewable energy before. And like I said, we have it now. And we have 1,000 megawatts of renewable energy sources, and specialists understand that by 2024, it will reach 5 or 9,000 megawatts, which is a big volume, especially given that we started from scratch. By the way, it's interesting that at this conference, we have two co-chairs of the Russian Association of Renewable Energy, Mr. Kirill Komarov, who is already here, and yours truly. And it's really important for me that Rosatom, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with this directly, did choose its strategic path to renewable energy for good and committed truly, and it implements projects to build renewable energy farms, and it's really important for the country overall. In this respect, I will disagree with those who say that there are no positive developments in Russia. It's not true. But of course, we have to fight harshly with the opponents, with the conservatives who say that renewable energy is senseless, we need to just use gas and forget about everything else. And the fact that renewable energy sources did spring to life in Russia is a big success of common sense in Russian policy. And let me be frank in saying that the numbers that I mentioned would not have been possible unless, for many years, the Ministry of Economic Development and the Ministry of Energy and the government had developed a very complex mechanism of support of renewable energy sources that did work eventually. And it's really important for us that the numbers that I just cited, the targets for 2024, would be implemented. And now we're discussing 2025 and 2035 targets, and we hope that Russia will not break its policy in this respect, and on the contrary, will support it despite the resistance from the conservatives, which is very serious indeed, like I said. This is the sectoral aspect, but if we talk about the country overall and go back to our goals and targets, I have to agree with Mr. Dergiriev, who clearly outlined that, of course, we will need to set the realistic, ambitious goals of the country for 2030. I'm sure we'll make it happen. And it's really important that the presidential representative who's responsible for these issues voiced this openly at this meeting. And I think that this is the most important thing for the country itself and for our relations with the EU, and most importantly for everybody on Earth, because we all understand that, as Mr. Eder rightly said, we need to ensure that we give peace to the world. It's not a local story. It's either a global story or not at all. And of course, Russia can and must contribute to addressing these global challenges. Thank you. Mr. Chubais, a small question to you. Several times we have mentioned hydrogen energy. I know that you take personal interest in this, and this is part of Rosnano's agenda. Could you please comment on the prospects of this policy in Russia and these technologies in Russia? You know, I think that this is an absolutely essential topic. And the appreciation of its importance at the country level is already a reality, I think. Several days ago, a roadmap was adopted, and a number of essential documents in this area are being adopted as well. Why? Because I think that hydrogen for Russia is at the same time, I mean, truly strategically in the horizon of 20 to 40 years, it's simultaneously a great challenge and a great opportunity. What do I mean by this? And I mean that there are many people here who understand the state of play in the Russian energy sector very well, and they understand that huge investments were made through the energy reforms in the 2000s, which created a good basis, which means that we have the capacities to task ourselves, to really task ourselves with hydrogen generation. Moreover, we've mentioned several kinds, green and blue hydrogen, and I think that Russia has absolutely unique potential, unique resources to actually work with green hydrogen that is produced using renewable energy sources for a whole number of reasons. I wouldn't like to dwell on them right now, but we have absolutely fantastic opportunities here. I've already cited the numbers of renewable energy farms that we have just commissioned. And if you use your opportunities smartly and the added value smartly, we could create a strong green hydrogen industry in Russia. And it's not enough. There is the second argument, which is more important than the first one. And it's quite simple, in fact, but still very global. Just like, as we all understand, Russia and Europe are tied by this colossal gas infrastructure. I don't know about the value of it, but we're talking more than tens of billions of dollars, actually hundreds of billions invested in the past 70 years in its construction and maintenance. So let's look at the structure in terms of very long-term strategic prospects. We understand that the global energy transition was not conceived by enemies of Russia. It's a reality, and we understand that coal consumption peaks in 2020s, then in the 30s it's oil, and in the 40s it will be gas, and what's next? Let's think about what happens to Russia and this infrastructure beyond 2040. This is something that you need to think of in advance, 30 or 40 years in advance. In my opinion, green hydrogen added in small proportions to the existing gas transport infrastructure could strategically turn Russia from an exporter of carbons with inevitable carbon trace and negative impact into a country from that forms the greenest fuel. Green hydrogen, I think this is a huge challenge for Russia, but at the same time, a huge opportunity. We understand very well that adding gas in a proportion of about 5 to 7% to the total volume should not cause any negative technological effects. And if you resolve all the certification issues, it could become not just a new strategic track, but a whole strategy of interaction between Europe and Russia. Mike, I'm sorry, it's timing. Oh, just the last phrase, okay. We all mentioned that gas transport infrastructure and hydrogen infrastructure is being built in Europe. Let's integrate the existing infrastructure that is used to export gas with the infrastructure for transit of hydrogen that is under construction. And then it can be a global Russian-EU project for decades to come. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chubais. And now I pass the floor to Stefan Nyström, head of the Swedish Environmental Agency.
Thank you. Доброе утро, Moscow.
Please stick to the timing, 5 minutes.
Доброе утро. Would have loved to be in Russia, but we'll do it over online instead. So let me extend my gratitude to the organizers of this important historic conference perhaps more important than ever, to meet within the international community to share experiences, to discuss how to kill two birds with one stone, namely combat COVID-19, increase the speed of the transition towards a fossil-free world, and reap the benefits of the green fossil-free industrial revolution that Mr. Timmermans was speaking about before. Could I have the first slide, please? I'll try and share some experiences from Sweden. Can you see the slides? There we go. Sweden has come up with a climate policy framework consisting of 3 parts, and it entered into force in 2018. And why is this important? Because it was taken by an 87% majority in the Swedish parliament, defining the playing field for the future. It is a very strong signal to business and the citizens and the general public that this goal will prevail independent of which color coming and future governments will have. In practical meaning, it means that climate policy will permeate all areas of policy: the tax system, the schemes for business development, housing policy, transportation policy, energy policy. It will go through all policy. Next slide, please. And so far, it hasn't hurt, really. We've increased our GDP by 85% since 1919, decreased our emissions by 27%. Next slide, please. And interestingly enough, speaking about the Industrial Revolution, which has already been touched upon by several speakers before, the business community is now leading the way towards becoming fossil-free. On a voluntary basis, during the last 3 years, we have had 22 roadmaps being presented for a fossil-free competitiveness in the future. And it covers 70% of the overall emissions in Sweden. The pledges for different kinds of, and the years you can read in the squares. Next slide, please. And here are the voices of 3 CEOs of major Swedish companies. And I like just to read H&M's H&M, the big clothes producers CEO, what she says. She says that to become climate positive by 2040 is about showing leadership, cooperation, and accelerating the sustainability work. We need it, the world needs it, and the customers want it. So for these companies, it is a matter of staying in the market and becoming more competitive for the future. And in Sweden, we don't speak about climate policy that much any longer, but we speak about policy, export policy, about export policy and green growth policy instead. We're making fossil-free steel and all these things that you can see in the picture. And only last week, the large major iron ore producer LKAB launched Sweden's biggest industrial investment ever. They're investing over 40 billion euros in new hydrogen technology to produce fossil-free iron ore for the world market during the next 10 years to come. Next slide, please. And the last slide. I think you can take the last slide if there is. 2 major challenges, it's supposed to say. Anyway, we have 2 major challenges. Next slide after that as well. I was a bit fast there. So next slide, please. There we go. What needs to happen in Sweden is that we have to have a very close cooperation between the business sector and the government, because neither can solve the crisis on their own. And we need CCS, carbon capture and storage, which hasn't been mentioned so far, and we need it pretty fast on a large scale. And let me just conclude by saying that it's been estimated that around 15% of the world's GDP over 2020 has been invested in the struggle against COVID-19, and fairly so. We need to do much more, probably because it hurts our economies enormously. And at the same time, it has been estimated that around 1% of the world's GDP would suffice to invest in new fossil-free technologies, including renewable energy, on a scale that would make it possible for us to reach the Paris Agreement. So 15% of the GDP in the fight against COVID-19 this year, and only 1% which is needed in investment over time to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. This is clearly a business case, since we also know from the Stern report, authored already in 2006, that it would cost between 5 and 20% of the world's GDP if we don't comply with the Paris Agreement. So we can do this if we work together across borders between companies and nations and continents, and not least in today's respect, in close cooperation between Russia and the EU. Thank you.
Спасибо, господин Нистрюм.
Thank you,
Замечательно.
Mr. Nystrom. These are some great results and very ambitious and legit plans. So Andrei Vedyahin, Deputy Chairman of the Board of Sberbank. Mr. Vedyahin, you're the only financial person here today. Mr. Zavgerev has already raised the issue of the sources of funding of the green transition. So, in your opinion, what's the role of financial institutions in incentivizing your clients to transition to carbon-free economy? And what's your view of your contribution into the funding of these big costs of the transition? Thank you so much, Andrei. Good afternoon. You can switch into Russian to listen. Does it work? Okay. Can you hear me?
Да, должно быть слышно.
Есть.
You should hear me. Yes, I do. So, good afternoon, Andrei, Your Excellency, dear colleagues. Indeed, the carbon trace of footprint of banks is not that big. However, we have an obligation to help our clients reduce their carbon footprint, and we have the 8 steps that Sber does as a bank and as an ecosystem to help this. So, lending to green projects, we lend to wind, solar, and nuclear generation. Kirill Komarov, who already spoken from Rosatom and from Rosnana. Mr. Chupa has already spoken. We work with them actively. Secondly, of course, we incentivize our clients to be environmentally responsible in their behavior, which means that the bank, as any lender, has its own risk management policy, and we've already incorporated some restrictions on the lending of our clients with unacceptably high environmental risks, such as recall of license due to disproportionate environmental footprint, etc., into our policies. And by the end of 2020, we will cover the whole portfolio with the scoring, and will be assigning the percentage rates and the interest rates depending on the degree of this risk. We've already used this for the first time to issue a loan to Kaz Sistema. So the higher the rating, the lower the rate in the system. Thirdly, we facilitate the development of the green loan financing. We've already issued 100 million worth of green bonds with RZD, Russian Railways, and we think that this helps our clients a lot. Excuse me. And the next thing is that we start consulting the largest companies on sustainable growth risks and social risks. With Rosatom, we had a cooperation agreement in this area, and we will be consulting our largest clients on this. It's also really important that we are a big organization ourselves, and we do our own procurement, thereby incentivizing green procurement suppliers. From this November, we have already incorporated the provisions on sustainable development into our relations with suppliers in the system. We also work with private clients and encourage them to participate in sustainable development instruments. We see a lot of demand for this. We also do environmental outreach and, of course, reduce our own environmental footprint. And by 2023, we need to have 30% of our energy sourced green, and we'll also use blockchain technologies to trace the green certificates that have already been mentioned today. Also, we naturally need the help of the government here. And we need some special preferential terms on loans and guarantees and all the funding tools that we provide including green bonds, etc. And the risk weight tracing is also implicated here. And this is something that we've been discussing actively with Внешэконом Bank. And there's a number of other technical tools that could help develop green funding through banks. And we are in deep discussion with the central bank on this. Thank you so much, Alexander. Unfortunately, we're already out of time with this session, and I would ask Mr. Dergiriev to summarize our work in a few words. Thank you so much. I will try to make it a minute. I actually shortened my presentation to leave some time for discussion. Unfortunately, we weren't able to make it happen. So my message was a topic for discussion. I've said it several times, including to the Federal Chancellor of Germany at the dialogue. The question is, wouldn't it be right for the sake of global greenhouse gas reduction to put climate projects outside the scope of any sanctions? So any company that claims that they want to implement a climate-related project should have access to funding of any institutions, European, international, any sources. I'm convinced that it would be the first step for global reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, because any company would have the resources, the opportunities to modernize, to be energy efficient and less energy consuming. That would be the question that I wanted to ask to you. Are we ready to declare environmental projects outside the scope of the sanctions? Thank you for your attention. Thank you. And with this, I would like to thank all the panelists, the ambassador, presidential advisor, all the other participants, and the viewers that are watching us online. This is just the first plenary session. Let me remind you, we'll be working for the next 3 days, and it's quite clear that we are covering a global agenda, and this is one of the most important topics in the world for the next 30 or more years. Thank you so much for your contributions. I wish you all productive work and stay healthy.